here. Okay. Here we go. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. We're really delighted to have, it's always exciting to have a debut novelist with us, and Lauren Nossett is going to be discussing her brand new book, The Resemblance. There it is. And Lauren has signed a batch of books for us. There's a copy of that. And I'll go ahead and put a link in the comments field for those of you watching if you'd like to purchase one of our signed copies. And our friend Ashley Winstead is very kindly joined us to talk to Lauren a little bit today. And she's done a couple of really great events with us in the past. One day we'll get you out here live, hopefully for book 3, right?
We did have her live.
Yeah, I came for Housewife. You weren't there.
You were in Hawaii, which is why you don't remember it.
Which is an amazing excuse.
Well, I've embarrassed myself in another way.
No, you haven't. I do this all the time.
I'll come back when you're there, Patrick. How about
That's
that?
right.
It's really hard to keep up. But Ashley and I'm trying to think who Sandra Brown, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, we had a wonderful
Sandra
time,
Brown.
and we went out to Virtue to eat afterward, and it was right before Sandra and the giant storm in Texas, and I've never really checked back to see if she survived. I mean, the house. I know Sandra survived, but I was a little worried about her because of the awful storm around where she was. Yep.
Trouble.
Yeah. Yep. We still have some autographed copies of the newest book here, Last Housewife. And I'll also put a link up to that in the comments field. But if you have questions for Lauren or Ashley, go ahead and put them in. And Barbara usually brings me on screen towards the end of the hour. Be happy to ask any questions you might have. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. It's a real pleasure to meet you. Nossett like faucet. We've already had this discussion, but for those of you who are watching it, it's always good to get the author's name right if you can. You can't really mess up Winstead, but it's possible to. So Ashley has written 2 really super dark academic mysteries, particularly In My Dreams I Hold a Knife, which also explores, some of the violence and whatever in fraternity culture. And I think this conversation is particularly apt given what just happened at the University of Virginia and the kind of awful things that seem to be happening on campus or campus-related crimes or school crimes. I don't think it's something we all really want to think about. And I sort of like the British approach, where they're in the hallowed halls at Oxford, and it's a lot more like Dorothy Sayers and Lord Peter Wimsey, and the crimes are more elegant. They're not just, the sort of awful and inexplicable, I might add, crimes that seem to happen here. But in fact, Lauren does a deep dive into fraternity culture and the resemblance. So, but before we start that, I'd love to talk to you just about what is the dark academic subgenre, because it's suddenly come on strong. Remember when I said, Ashley, that I predicted 2 years ago that the Gothic was going to be the next big thing? But now I'm wondering if dark academic is sort of an extension of the Gothic, or how do you see it? Lauren, how do you see it?
Yeah, I think so. I just did on Instagram on my Reading with Bowie account, I did the top 25 kind of campus novels, dark academia novels that had come out in the last decade. Because really, I mean, I start thinking about that genre with The Secret History, but that was 30 years ago. But the last 10 years, we've seen so many titles. I mean, Ashley, with In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife, right? Like that to me, especially with the complicated friend drama, going back to school, seeing, what kind of threads have unraveled during the college experience, and then going back and investigating that. There have been a lot of titles that investigate these kind of dark mysteries and what can happen when a bunch of young people are in this insular, isolated community, which a lot of college campuses are. But I liked In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife because it takes place at the fictional Duquette University. Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Ashley?
Yeah.
which is based in North Carolina, right?
Yeah.
Is it? Yeah, which
I
I
stole
love.
from a bunch of colleges, so no one could accuse me of using a college. You were brave and used UGA, a real college. I
I
don't want
was
anyone
nervous.
to pin me down.
Right. But I love that because so many, like Barbara said, a lot of these dark academia or campus novels take place at the kind of Oxford, Cambridges, or they take place at liberal arts colleges in the Northeast. And then there's something fun about and different about setting one of these in the South, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And that was kind of part of a question I wanted to ask you about why Athens, why Georgia, why fraternity culture specifically as your focus. But Barbara, I recall, and I have been shamelessly using and stealing something you said when we talked, crediting you, of course, but you said, dark academia seems to be the new, manor, locked room manor sort of format or setting. That kind of like enclosed, rarefied air, smaller group of characters who are all forced together, and you've got a mystery to solve. And I just thought that was so spot on. That this is a kind of, especially seeing the rise of it in the States, by American authors in the last few years, thinking about academic institutions as our closest version of, this really elite, rarefied air kind of institution, with, the appropriate architecture, the beauty, the Gothic architecture. And that's something that I think that's why people love traditional dark academic settings, right? Because there's something just so seductive about the idea of like losing yourself in a gorgeous library, and maybe there's secret passageways in this university that's been around for hundreds of years, blah blah blah. But you and I chose a different path with this kind of Southern setting. And I think of it as a little more democratizing, like trying to most readers, most people, myself included, don't have that Ivy League experience, but there's a lot of there's a lot to be mined in an academic experience, like a state school or my fictional college. So I kind of just want to linger and ask you about the South and fraternity culture and what kind of drew you to taking dark academia there.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's a different student body, right? That's at a state college or a big public university. And then too, even though it's still can be an isolated community, if you set it at a big university like the UGAs of the world, you're talking about an isolated community of 30 to 40,000 students.
True. Yeah.
This is an isolated community of maybe 10,000 or 5,000. It's just it opens up. It's still that locked door kind of mystery where you assume it is someone within this close body of friends or within this close community, but at the same time, this community is a lot larger, and then it allows perhaps for an investigation of other things going on within the community. Because a lot of times, I think the draw of some of these campus novels, and even one of the first kind of campus novels I remember reading was A Separate Peace, John Knoll's A Separate Peace, and you have this sense of so this is a boarding school, but these boys are at the boarding school and it seems like they're safe and protected from the outside world. But really the realities of the war that are going on outside slowly start to shape and affect their lives, despite feeling this sense of security. And I think that's something else that, and Barbara was talking about this earlier, is you feel, or there's a sense of safety because you're in this isolated community. There's this focus on education. There's structures that are familiar, and it can give you a false sense of security, both as a reader, right, when you're diving into the story, but as we've seen, even with the events Barbara referenced, the really tragic events that happened this week, is you're not actually protected from the outside world. You're still living in it. There's always this talk, and it would bother me as someone who's who was a student for so long and who worked in academia for so long, but the real world versus, the academic world or the student world or whatever. And no, that's part of the real world too. And of course, you're still affected by real world issues, and students are dealing with real life issues while they're students. And the surrounding community and world can affect them just like it affects everyone else. But while they're, potentially not in their support system, right? They don't have, perhaps their family to turn to, their close group of friends. And so they really are in this new setting while they're navigating still real world things, just slightly different because of the setting that they're in.
Don't you think that for a long time, the greater danger was usually directed towards women? Rape and so forth on campus was the big thing. But what's interesting, I think, in your book is that the violence really is falling upon young men. And Ashley has dealt with that too. And it isn't just campus mysteries. Because a lot of people choose to write a crime novel at a class reunion where basically they're not still in school, but it was what happened in school that, so it's really like going back, to that same circle. But the British, what I find also interesting is the level of violence, because you go back and read Gouty Night by, Dorothy Sayers. It's very elegant. It's academic. And, a lot of academic mysteries where they had like literary or, it was, I don't want to say more refined crime, because I don't think that's really fair, but, there was there wasn't so much just plain violence.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing, as we did in the shooting the other day, how do you explain that? People shot on a bus. There's nothing elegant about that at all. And if you're going to be writing contemporary crime novels, I think you have to adjust to that reality that campus crime is taking on a different aura. Even The It Girl by, Ruth Ware is another, or Ellie Griffith's Bleeding Heart Yard. I spoke to her earlier today. It's different when you read your book. It's just a different world.
Yeah. And I will say that something I think, that brought up a ton of thoughts. And the first one is that dark academia is not just this crime on campus, but is also an aesthetic in its own right? So that's why you look on Instagram and Tumblr, and you have just hundreds of thousands of posts of people dressing up in the dark academic plaid, and and so it's got a whole flavor and a whole just a kind of aesthetic sensibility that I think the Resemblance really taps into. Can I read the first paragraph of your first chapter? Because I think that will it's perfectly encapsulates what I mean by dark academic aesthetic.
I would love that.
Okay.
I'm always really flattered when people pull out lines from the book to read, or that they say that they like it. So please.
Love it. I'm going to backtrack later and gush about your book as a segue to more questions, because I just loved it. Okay, so this is the first chapter of The Resemblance, and it starts, "In my mind's eye, it's always autumn in Athens. Those sweltering days of summer are immediately forgotten when the first red leaf twists off its branch. On North Campus, a gold-winged elm and scarlet oak stand like sacred guardians, ancient harbingers of wisdom and secrets. Just before the unadorned face of New College, a sugar maple shudders in the wind. But despite the breeze stirring the leaves on the pavement, the day is heating up. There's a trickle of sweat between my shoulder blades. And there's something else, something I can't quite define, a tingling under my skin, a shadow at the corner of my eye, a feeling that the world's askew and waiting to right itself." Okay, so just in that beginning paragraph, we are on campus it's fall, the leaves are turning, there's, something unsettling in the air. That's like check, check, check. All of your dark academic aesthetics just kind of weaving together right off the bat. And I think that that is something, just as much as the kind of campus setting and the idea of like untangling a mystery at college, that people are here for the aesthetics of it. What do you think, Lauren? Like, how much did you think about that when you were writing The Resemblance?
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because you mentioned, of course, it takes place in fall. And, the college and the US system, most students go to college in fall and spring, but there's something about fall that's back to school that really, you think of sweater weather and all of it, and cozy coffee drinks. And, if you think of the liberal arts, colleges that we talked about, studying by a fire or something. But of course, I mean, you live in Texas, I'm in Georgia. I mean, when school starts in the fall, end of August, middle of August, whenever it is, it's still 80 degrees here.
Yeah.
And so this is, I had to think about that and I said it actually November 12th. So just a few days ago is kind of when the story begins. And it is just now cold in Georgia. But really when fall starts, it's not cold at all. So all those things that I associate with dark academia and the genre, because so often it is placed in the Northeast or in Oxford, Cambridge, you kind of have to mess with the timeline a little bit to get that like a fall vibe that
that's such a good point. With these Southern dark academic novels, you kind of have to fudge and say like, well, there was a bunch of semester and now it's November when it's, dark academic time.
Yeah. And the days are getting shorter. I think that plays into it, right? The nights are lengthening. And, my editor said something interesting when we were talking about the rise of this genre, especially now, right? Why now? And he was saying a whole generation of people, so younger people, especially, the ones on TikTok and that are dressing in the stark academia aesthetic, who grew up reading Harry Potter and really wanted to go to Hogwarts. And so there's this kind of love of that setting. And of course, the same thing, Hogwarts, this fictionalized school, they feel really safe, right? But then there's this evil on the outside that slowly infiltrates, which is that very common trope that we find in dark academia. But yes, I did think about that. And as someone who really loves the genre, it was important for me to set it in the fall. I will say there will be another book coming that's set in the spring. So that's kind of interesting to think about in terms of, what do the leaves look like and what is the climate like?
That skipped right to, I was going to ask you about that because I was so hopeful that there was going to be another.
Yes, so we will see Detective Marlette Kaplan again, but still in the university setting, but looking at a different side of university life. And then her, without any spoilers, kind of with what she's experienced through the first book, she has a slightly different relationship with the police force, what she thinks about justice, all of those things that she kind of has to reconcile in book 2. So
I'm so excited. So we dove like right into dark academia, and I have more questions for you about that. But can you just like, maybe for viewers who haven't read your book synopsis, just give like a quick grounding description of what this is about?
Yeah, of course. So The Resemblance, it's a murder mystery. It takes place in Athens, Georgia, at the University of Georgia. We begin with a fatal hit and run on the university campus. The detective who's first on the scene, she is the daughter of a UGA professor. And she, for her own personal reasons, in addition to just the way that the student is dressed, immediately suspects that the student who's been the victim of the hit and run is a member of Greek life, and that Greek life might have even been involved with his death. And so the witnesses who are there at the scene of the crime, they all agree on 2 things. One is that they think that the driver of this car is identical to the victim, and that he was smiling. And so there's this kind of sinister aspect to it as well, that of course reinforces everything that Detective Marlette Kaplan thinks about Greek life and what their involvement might be.
Oh, I love her. I love a prickly protagonist who's just not going to let anyone tell them what they are and aren't going to do. Okay, this is the part where I gush because I absolutely love this book. And for all those watching, this is just such a fabulous mystery and such an amazing addition, I think, to the dark academic canon. And I read this book this past spring, and I was actually traveling through Scotland while I was reading your book. And I did not want to leave my hotel room because I just wanted to stay and read. So that's the highest endorsement I can possibly give, is I didn't want to go on my vacation. So it is absolutely gripping.
Can I say that we connected a year ago, or over a year ago, through the kind of Bookstagram community, because I had read in my dreams, I hold a knife, and had kind of posted a picture with my dog Bowie, which I do a lot with reviews, and had struck up a conversation. It's so lovely to then have had you read and blurb the book, and then now be talking face to face for the first time after kind of messaging. I always say that the Bookstagram on Instagram community is the best part of the internet, because it really allows for these kind of relationships, and it's so cool to be able to have this conversation. And
I know,
because,
it's such an honor for me.
I was a fan of you first, so you know.
Thank you. That's my lighting isn't good, but I'm blushing if you can't see that. I hope Bookstagram stays the way it is, for all time. So it is such a lovely, wonderful corner of the internet where, you meet so many wonderful people. So we've talked about like dark academia, your desire to write in that genre, kind of place this book in this subgenre that really started with The Secret History 30 years ago, but has seen this boom recently for a lot of these reasons. But what like drew you or inspired you to write this particular story? Like, do you remember when you were sitting there, maybe with your laptop or maybe taking a walk, however you write and create, and just thought, wow, this is the start of something? Like, how does that come to you? A character, dialogue? Where did it start?
Yeah, I actually, for this one, I have a distinct memory. It started with Marlitt. It started with her. She does have this really strong voice. And I remember it was late at night, and I just had this, it's something that happens midway through the book. When I first started, it was the prologue, but then it was moved midway through the book, where she finds herself in this really precarious situation. I feel like if I say it might be a spoiler, but I sat down, I saw where she was in that situation. I heard her tell it in her voice, and it just sat down, and I wrote that scene. And I will say that rarely happens where I actually, have a whole scene that I am able to sketch out, but it was just, her voice was so strong in that moment that I sat down and wrote it. And so it really started with her, her as I don't even know that I knew she was a detective at that point. It was just in this situation, and it started with her voice. And it was late at night, and I remember sitting down in this big kind of armchair, just like furiously. I think I must have, a lot of times when I get ideas, I type it in my phone. There's something about notes in my phone versus typing it on the computer that feels less like work. And I've also learned that if I write it down when I'm really excited, I can't read my handwriting later. So better to at least have it somewhere I can, send it to a Word doc. So yeah, it really started with her. And then I think it was months later that I was going to bed, and I thought of the mystery, what ultimately made a mystery. And then I combined those.
Because she was first.
She was first. Yeah, she was absolutely. I mean, which makes a lot of sense just based on her personality, that she would kind of insist in my head to be first. It started with her.
Great. I do the notes in the phone thing too, but I have very lazy thumbs that don't want to type for that long. And I guess, that's how I type. And so they're never very useful because I try to shorten every word. Because I'm just, can't be bothered to type whole things out. So I admire your notes app discipline with that.
So do you write in your computer, or do you write freehand?
Oh no, I write in my computer. I also cannot read my own handwriting, mostly because I grew up thinking that cursive was really the only way, you know, it's like the fanciest way to write. So it was the only way I should write. And so now my handwriting looks like someone trying to be a fairy tale princess. It takes me about 30 minutes to write a paragraph. So yeah, it's all typing.
Yeah. I didn't, for me, there's something about sitting at the computer. It feels like work, and which of course I have to do at some point, but at the beginning stages, I really love writing in that feels more inspired for what, I guess, because I can, if I'm on a walk or something and think of whatever it is, I can type. I can't talk into my phone though. I talked to someone recently and she said that's how she wrote, is she'd be on a walk or run and she'd dictate to her phone. But to me, I have to see the text,
the language,
writing. Yeah. Otherwise, if I'm talking, I feel less articulate for whatever reason.
You're just a visual person, I feel, or maybe that's how it works.
So, Lauren, you're referencing earlier work. This is a debut novel. So tell us what earlier work it is you're talking about.
Well, so I guess I was a professor, and so I've written books from a scholarly perspective and articles from a scholarly perspective. But I've written, this is my 7th novel I've finished. It's the first work of fiction I have published. So I had to write, I think, a lot of not great books before I got to a book where I felt like I had something. So for all the writers out there, keep going at it, because it took me seven tries, and there are 6, books saved on my hard drive that are full, 90,000 whatever thousand word books, but they just weren't right, So
what do you think they were lacking that didn't arouse enough interest in a publisher but what were the weaknesses that you think you had?
Plot. So I was trying to write literary fiction, and I think because that's what I was reading. But for me, writing a mystery, there's already these rules that you have to follow, right? You have a direction, right? There is a crime that needs to be solved, and then you just go from that point. Where I was trying to write literary fiction, I think I needed more parameters, just having something that was character driven wasn't enough for me. I needed. Well,
I do think that's a huge benefit of crime, especially for new authors, or mystery, is that there's a scaffolding, and it does allow you to structure. Laurie King and I have had this discussion many times, and with other authors, and you do need a story. I mean, you really, characters are wonderful, and, plot should arise from character and what they will do. Landscape is terrific, all the rest of it. But if you're going to have an actual story, you do need some kind of a structure. And, I've had lots of conversations. I myself I like investigations because my mind works best if I start somewhere and I move forward towards, it must be the legal training or something. I don't do as well with the really twisty psychological drama where you're never quite sure where you are and you're not ever sure where you're going to end up. Right. I mean, I read them and I like them, and some of them are wonderful, but my own mind works better in the more straightforward, police procedural or private eye novel or whatever it is, where things move forward. And I do think that is the sort of puzzle aspect of it also, I think, is often important to readers. I mean, there isn't really a puzzle to solve in a lot of psychological fiction that comes out at the moment. You're just there for the ride, right? You hang on and it goes wherever it's going to go. And then you go, wow, and there's another twist and whatever. But it's not really likely the reader can work it out. That's sort of the point, right?
Oh yeah, that haunts me. Is stumping readers, yeah.
So it makes perfectly good sense that you would finally have come to, publishing a novel because you solved the structure problem. But now that you've seen it, that doesn't mean that you can't maybe resurrect some of your literary fiction and actually embed a plot in it.
Yeah, I think so. Someone asked me that the other day at a talk, if there were any ones that I would resurrect. And I thought, there's one of the six.
I
There's
mean,
one
maybe
that
parts of one, I mean,
True.
yeah, I mean, books are made up of so many different things that I feel like nothing's ever really wasted for a writer. As long as
No,
you're
and I think sometimes you need more life experience, right? Like it's something that maybe now, with a few years and other experiences that I've had, I can go back to some of these novels with a new perspective. So I think, but to me, it's the fun thing is coming up with new ideas. So it's you always want to start the new mystery, and whenever I'm getting close to finishing one, I know that I'm getting close because I have an idea for another one that I really want to start. And I resent having to finish the one I'm working on because I think, I mean, I don't know how you are, Ashley, if you have so many just starts of ideas that you have and want, people always want to give you ideas as an author. And it's like, the ideas aren't the problem.
It's the follow through.
Exactly. The idea is great. I can sit down and write a 3,000 word idea, but then I have to write the next 97,000 words to finish it and make everything work together.
I am laughing because we are so much the same on so many levels. Like the ideas are not the problem. I know I'm finishing close to the end of one book when the next one won't let me go. And I too, coming out of academia, struggled with plot. And
you find academia like that.
I do because like you said, I wasn't reading a ton of genre fiction in my PhD program. I was reading just literary fiction, really. It was a really narrow focus. And so you get it in your head that what I'm using this in scare quotes, but what good books are that sort of like model of literary fiction, and even more particular, like the MFA program since the 1960s version of literary fiction that's just kind of like dominates the market. And so that just wasn't working for me, for my brain or my voice. So it's so funny. And it was when I switched to mystery writing as well that all of a sudden things gelled and I felt like I took off.
That's fascinating. Okay, well, I know you're supposed to be asking me questions, but I have a question because you did these two kind of mystery campus novels, right?
Yeah.
My Dreams, I Hold a Knife, and That Last Housewife. But in between, you did a romance, which is the only romance I've ever read, and I loved it. And I recommend it to so many people who I know are romance readers who have also loved it. But how did you go from, the academia background to the campus novel? To me, that makes sense because that's what I did. But then to do romance in between, I think is really wonderful and also makes it so that you're not, typecast into a certain kind of writing either because you broke it up this way.
Well, thank you for reading that book. And I'm so happy you enjoyed it. I just go where my brain goes, and it's really hard to contain it. I've been lucky enough to have my publishing team let me do that so far. We'll see how long that lasts. But I will say a consistent theme is just really stealing shamelessly from my professional life. So there was coming out of academia, it was dark academia. The characters in my romance book and future romance book are involved in the world of politics, where I moved after academia. So it's mostly just me sitting around at my day jobs thinking like, it would be a lot more fun if there was some murder to solve, or some it would be great if there was an ex-boyfriend showed up right now.
An office romance.
That is just the through line.
Well, I mean, they say to write what and I mean that's very much for me, setting these novels in the campus setting, in the academic setting. That's very much what I know, and I'm so impressed by people who do the world building involved in fantasy, right? I'm sure they're still taking characters and aspects from their lives, but just that kind of world building or in sci-fi is just amazing to me as someone who feels like I write what is very close to home. So,
well, I have to ask, speaking of close to home, are you currently a professor, like working or are you full-time novelist now?
So right now, full-time novelist. I will say I miss teaching. My last year of teaching was in 2021, and that was we were on Zoom, teaching still, which is kind of sad
I
that
can't even imagine.
Last classes I taught were not in the classroom. They were, on the computer. But so not teaching. I was teaching though when I wrote both the first and the second book. So they, but I wasn't at UGA. So I think there is something about not being right in the setting in which I'm writing. And even the UGA, which is of course a fictionalized version of the university, but it's also a nostalgic version of the university. It's more probably similar to the university that existed a decade ago when I was there, than what it was when I was writing the book.
I was going to ask about reactions from your like fellow faculty and students to hear, because I too like jumped out of academia and then wrote my dark academic book. So brave to do it.
So when I did a reading last week in Richmond, which is where I taught at Randolph-Macon College, and that's where I was when I was writing both of the books. So I was in Virginia writing these books set in Georgia. And it was nice. A lot of my old colleagues, professor colleagues came out and were there, and they've been super supportive. And I think, we're all, within the university, we're critical of certain aspects of it from the inside too. So I don't think it was, and even with Greek life, I think we can, on one hand, acknowledge that in a setting and in a world where students are feeling increasingly isolated and alienated and are struggling with mental health issues, among so many other things, Greek life, Greek letter institutions can offer a community to students who are away from their friends and family. And at the same time, there are problematic behaviors that are part of this culture that can have really tragic consequences. And so for me, I think
it's more brutal for boys than, do you think fraternity culture is more difficult than sorority culture?
I think we've seen in terms of fatalities that are related to Greek life incidents, there have been more fatalities associated with fraternities. But I think this culture, and Marlitt, the detective, who she says she kind of collects the misdeeds of Greek life and these statistics. And if for people interested in more the nonfiction side of this, John Heschinger has a book called True Gentlemen, and he spent about 2 years with different fraternal organizations across the U.S. and has written a book on that experience, and a book on different both fatalities, but also the sexual assault that happens at some of these parties. So I think it's dangerous for both, but for different reasons. And so this book in particular looks at the effect. Primarily, I think it's interested too in this perpetrator victim cycle. Like that's something that the novel, it's something I was interested in, these power dynamics, but then something that the novel itself investigates. But I think, so Marlitt quotes a lot of these statistics that have come out recently, like the fact that women who are, in sororities are more likely to be raped, and that men in fraternities are more likely to commit rape. And those are based on studies that have come out recently. And then the fact that every year at least one fraternity member dies in a fraternity-related incident. And when I was finishing the draft of this novel, that was in 2019, and that year 5 men at 5 different universities died in fraternity-related incidents, which is so unnecessary, so tragic when you think of all the friends and families. I know both Ashley and I have experienced sudden loss this past year. And it's just to think that happens to anyone is just awful, or that you could send your student off to college and they don't come home. Right. And so there are, as much as it can offer a community, there are real problems that need to be addressed within these.
Well, there are. I mean, you're so right that for me, I went from Chicago to Stanford. And I was I was too young. I was one of those students that back in the in the 50s was jumped up courses. So I was barely 17 when I went 2,000 miles away from home. And it was a very strange culture because Stanford allowed fraternities, but it outlawed sororities. So the boys had all of the structure of Greek life with its pros and cons, but the women were faced with a lottery system. We didn't even get to choose who we lived with or the places that we lived for a first couple of years. So it was very difficult to cope with no real sense of community. I've forgiven myself for a few mistakes I made because now I recognize, that was probably not in any condition to actually make them. But I would have my mother was the president of her Delta Gamma at Northwestern, and she had a hugely positive experience of back in the 30s of sorority life. And, it was just very strange for me. I felt like there was a part of my college experience that I never got to have and that I would have benefited from it. But I'm wondering if that's changed because I'm talking about the end of the 50s because, I went in 58 and graduated in 62 and life is so dramatically different now. I wonder if I would have the same reaction if I were, young and starting out today, because I don't have any real experience with contemporary academic life.
Yeah. And I mean,
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, well, I was going to say, so I went to Georgia. My mom also went to Georgia, and she was a KD, and so really wanted me to be a part of sorority. For her, it did. She was also shy. She's not anymore, but at the time she was, and that was how she made friends. And actually, I think she really feels like the friends she had there, some of whom she still keeps in contact with,
Right.
They brought her out of her shell and really changed, and I think maybe offered that part of that experience that you felt like you were missing. That was, a huge part of her experience, and I think why she enjoyed the college life. And to this day, I mean, the Greek Letter Institute or organizations, they offer so much in terms of, and I will say I wasn't a member of a sorority, but I did go to fraternity parties, so I was around that community and what the kind of social network that it offered too. But Ashley, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I was just thinking about that I don't think that the phenomenon of having vastly different rules for fraternities and sororities has changed, because when I went to school, it had been and was still, and I believe is still a thing that, there were sororities and fraternities, but fraternities were allowed to have parties on campus in their houses, and sororities weren't. And fraternities were allowed to live in their house, more male members or more members, and sororities were limited because, there were laws against creating brothels. Literally, that was what that was what prohibited people from living in sorority houses. So if you think about the effect that has on power dynamics and social life, everyone is going to the fraternities for parties. The fraternity houses are where you're meeting people, where you're drinking. So as a young woman, you're always kind of traipsing. It's never on your own home turf, right? Your own territory. You're not in control of what this party looks like. You're always entering this space of the fraternity. And I love, because Lauren, power and privilege and inside and outside play such huge roles. Who has power, how power corrupts, the people whose hands it does find its way into. And so I'd love to just ask you about that, because that's just such a huge part of this book, through you exploring the Greek system at UGA. So can you talk about privilege in this book? And what the Greek culture looked like in the Resemblance.
Yeah. And so the Greek culture, and sororities play a role, but of course not as big of a role as the fraternities that Marlitt is investigating. And she's primarily focused on investigating Kappa, which is a fictional, that's not a real fraternity. That's one I made up for the book. But that is the fraternity that the victim of this fatal hit and run belonged to. Mm-hmm. And so as she's investigating this fraternity, she meets people with both privileged members and the not privileged members.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the members, for example, he's there on scholarship, right? He's not some of the moneyed elite that often are a part of these fraternities. But there's another fraternity member who is the son of the university president. And so to a certain extent, he gets a free pass in terms of his behavior and gets away with a lot of bad behavior because of this connection. And this is something that Marlitt and the novel really investigates too, is that these cycles of power and privilege and looking the other way, and what lessons these students are learning in their college years, so they're really formational years, how that could potentially play out into their jobs in the future, where they are often these well-connected, privileged men who are going to draw on the connections that they already that they're establishing in this Greek life. They're going to reach out to their alumni networks to get these jobs, have high positions, and then just repeat these cycles of power, but also potentially learning that they can get away with bad behavior because of the positions that they're in. They might continue these behaviors into their careers, whatever places of responsibility they find themselves, with potentially even greater consequences.
Yeah, so something I love about Marlitt is that, I think Amy Gentry said in an article she wrote for Crime Reads when she was talking about dark academia as a genre, that one of the central tropes is that fish out of water. So in dark academic novels, you're usually following a protagonist who is somehow, whether, it's because they have less privilege than the people at the school that they're going to or whatever, they are the outsider, bringing that outsider perspective. And Marlitt is an outsider, in every way you can be, really. She's an outsider when it comes to investigating Greek life on campus. And then she's an outsider again within her own job, within her own, the police department, because you see this perpetuation of the old boys club that she's watching, the young version of on campus in the fraternity kind of play out. Something I love, and I hope this isn't spoiling anything, but something I love about Marlitt and her relationship with her fellow police officers is that she feels like, as a young woman, they constantly want to shield and protect her. And that is something that drives her nuts. And she just wants to, she feels that as infantilization. And it's the most saccharine and kind version of, misogyny that you can get, but it's still, she feels that as a. So can you talk to us about Marlitt as this outside force, kind of bringing her perspective?
Yeah, I think one thing I loved about her is that she is the daughter of a professor. So to a certain extent, she has this insider outsider perspective where she's grown up in this world, right? Yeah. In a college town, but you're right, she's not a part of that world, but she has this inside knowledge that allows her to critique certain aspects of it because she is familiar with this outsider perspective as the daughter of a professor. And then you're right, and I think this is another thing I wanted to play with setting it in the South, is there is this Southern chivalrous nature that can be incredibly patronizing. And that is what she experienced, where her lieutenant, for example, wants to protect her from all the bad cases because she's a woman. So the men in the homicide unit are assigned whatever cases, but he sees him as a father figure and her as a daughter figure. And it creates this hierarchy beyond just the professional, right, lieutenant detective hierarchy that extends just because of her gender, because she's a woman. And so it was really interesting because from the lieutenant's perspective, he's protecting her, right? That again is that patronizing, chivalrous nature. But, for her, she's really has to fight back to be able to find her place on the force and then to be taken seriously when she does have real concerns. She's, to a certain extent, she's dismissed, right? What she thinks and why she thinks. And even though some of it, she does have her own reasons, her own prejudices, but she also knows these statistics, and in a way, she's more familiar with this college world, this academic world, than her peers because of her kind of inside knowledge with her mother. But she's always discounted. And to me, I like protagonists and detectives who have to come into conflict to prove themselves to that kind of additional tension as they're solving the mystery. So that was even though it was frustrating for Merlet, a fun place to write from for me as the writer.
I love that. And I was thinking, as Barbara was talking earlier about loving investigations, that your book like sits in between, this kind of dark academic, which tends to be, you've got your students on campus and there's something, with It Girl or some of my books and or Amy Gentry, other folks who are writing. But yours is this kind of, the Resemblance is kind of this amazing meld between this investigation, since the protagonist is a police officer, and that dark academic novel. And she kind of uses the fact that she's a young woman to slip between those two worlds. And I think that was just so fascinating to read. I loved that.
Thank you.
It seems to me that a common theme, well, not common, but oftentimes what you have, in students is that you have people who are fizzing with hormones and, their judgment is not all that great. And they're inclined to do really stupid things, particularly, I think, boys more so than girls. And those stupid things, it becomes clear, can affect their entire lives. And so it often just leads to cover up. Either they try to cover it up, their friends try to cover it up, or their parents or whoever the adult responsible for them tries to cover it up. And that, I think, plays out in the class reunion mystery. There's usually something that happened that got covered up, which is Ellie Griffith's Bleeding Heart Yard that I was mentioning to Lauren, is really a wonderful book. It's 21 years after they were in school, and yet something that happened in school drives, what's happening too. And that's true in the It Girl, the Ruth Ware book that she wrote this summer. But, you're dealing with late adolescence, which is the time when people are more inclined to do dumb things than probably any other time in their entire life. And consequences are not part of that, not really thinking about consequences. I mean, we've seen that play out on a national scale pretty recently, consequences aren't part of, the gestalt there. And well, I've tried to be tactful. Arizona State.
You're being so tactful.
I know. But I mean, you really do see it, if you have basically, kind of a giant frat boy who was, in charge for a while. Yuck.
There have been many of them, Barbara.
Yeah. But I think that from a plot standpoint, you've got all kinds of, potential crimes and so forth that you can create out of this pool that are not going to stretch credulity at all, because, we all know, and we probably all did, things that were rash, or things that, some of us escaped really serious consequences and some of us didn't. Some of us regret them. Some of us, don't, whatever. But it's just an interesting time of life. It's a really interesting time of life for you to be depicting. And so I think that's part of the appeal of the dark academic, is that maybe more mature readers can kind of remember, what it was like, and think either I had a lucky escape, or I wish I'd thought of that, or whatever,
Take me back is what I say.
It's a very powerful thing. Yeah. I think oftentimes as we grow older, certainly for me, and it's something that's come up recently with other authors and all, as we age, the things that we regret are the things we didn't do, much more than the things that we did do. We learn to forgive ourselves for the dumb things that we did, but you can't really recover the things that you turned away from. And so that can play into it too, because really college is what's going to shape the future for so many of these people. I know, it's a fascinating genre. It really is. Really like it.
My agent has asked me many times, like, why do you keep returning to college, for a setting? And I think you just hit it spot on, Barbara. It's like this really attractive moment of possibility in a lot of people's lives, where you've got those hormones fizzing, but you also have, like, in the back of your head, that there's kind of an excuse for your whatever behavior you end up indulging in, because it's like, this is the time of life to do it. And you do have those hormones fizzing. And so there's just so much possibility there. And it can skew really dark and it can skew really great.
Think about the Amish. They have something called a gap year. There's several really good Amish mysteries. And one of the features is they bring these children up, in a pretty rigid setting, very controlled. And they are allowed basically what the British call a gap year. They call it the Rumspringa, but basically they're allowed to go off in the world and, raise whatever hell they want and do whatever, and decide whether they want to come back and lead the more traditional disciplined life of their Amish community. And I think that's such a wise thing. Some of them don't fare well, obviously. But I think at least it gives them a chance. And I think the British idea of a gap year before you go to college is a really good idea, to just give yourself some world experience and think about what it is that you want to do. I often wish the American educational system allowed that. It allowed a gap year between high school and going on to college.
It's so driven, just, go college, right into your job, or grad school.
There's a lot of pressure there. So anyway, a fertile field. Patrick, come and join us and tell us if there's anything you want to contribute.
Yeah, I was on like the 7-year plan, I think, something like that.
Love it.
Yeah. It's such an interesting microcosm, isn't it? And not just the students, but the faculty, is fertile ground. I'm sure for writing about, because it's a place, at least in the English department where I was, it sort of protects its eccentrics, and you can have, I'm sure, some really interesting pathology going on with some professors. I know we all met them. I know there was the professor that was sort of a predatory character who was, preying on young TAs, grad students.
But then there's the whole question of battling it out for academic, stardom and the whole bit. Tony Millerman's Thief of Time, if neither of you read it, he won an Edgar for it, and the entire plot is driven by academic rivalry.
Oh, I need to read that.
Yeah.
Also, Bad Habits by Amy Gentry. I know I've like name checked her twice, but I love that book.
Hilariously, when I taught crime fiction at Arizona State for 3 years, every time we read Thief of Time, the kids all totally rejected it. They thought, there's no way that this was actually the motive for the murder. They just couldn't believe it. So it's kind of like that when the stakes are really low, because they just, it was so funny. But
when you're in it does not feel like the stakes are low. I'm sure, Lauren, you can.
Exactly.
Oh yeah, I started watching The Chair on HBO, and it was right after I had left teaching, and I had to turn it off. I was like, I can't watch a department meeting. I've just gotten out of those. I do not want to sit through another one with the different personalities and everything that comes into play. That made me think of Philip Ross, The Human Stain. Have y'all read that? When it just comes to departmental dynamics and faculty egos and just everything at play at the university. Yeah, it's such a rich setting on both sides of the desk, right? Both from the student
even talked about faculty mystery, as part of dark academia, but there are quite a few crime novels in which it's not the students that are at play, it's the faculty that are, the administration and so forth.
And each department has its own kind of, pathology or different flavor to it. My wife was in the physics department, and there was this character there who was this brilliant young guy who essentially the professors enabled him to live on campus without telling anybody, and he was able to like take showers there and sort of a mascot of the physics department. It's fun.
Indeed. Are there any questions from the audience?
Not many, which is why I'm kind of freestyling a little bit.
Okay.
Let's see. Just people that are weighing in about how intriguing the book sounds. And Well, one question is about, does each of you have favorites when it comes to mystery novels or crime fiction? Who are some of your faves? Lauren, you want to kick it off?
Well, I mean, I've been reading all these dark academia mysteries, so I'll go ahead and plug Ashley's book for another time. In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead here. There's also, if you like those return to campus group of friends who've done something bad and it unravels when they return. There's The Girls Are Also Nice Here, which is another one of those return to campus mysteries that I highly recommend. I just finished The Cloisters by Katie Hayes, which is a different kind of mystery.
I need to read that. Yeah.
It's really super. The tarot stuff is phenomenal.
And it's very Gothic. I mean, the setting itself feels very Gothic. So that's really wonderful.
But it's in a museum. It's set at the Cloisters, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's medieval. But, there again, a museum is not that different, than
academia.
Scholarship, the scholarship, the competition of finding that first discovery feels very similar to how it can be in an academic field when you're writing and publishing articles.
Yeah. Very much so.
Lisa Lutz had a fun one.
You read it. What, Patrick?
Lisa Lutz had a good one too, didn't she? A couple of years ago, the Setna University.
Yeah, she
did.
The
Accomplice, I think it was.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
She's good. Yeah. Really good.
How about you, Ashley? Anything you want to recommend?
Yeah, recently, this is not dark academia, but I was totally immersed in You're Invited by Amanda Jayatissa, which is a book that came out in August, and it is about an influencer who goes missing from her wedding in Sri Lanka, and her best friend, whose ex-boyfriend she was marrying, is accused of, her possible murder. And it was pitched as Crazy Rich Asians meets Lucy Foley, like the guest list. And it was so spot on. So if you like extravagant over the top weddings with a whole cast of nefarious characters and nonstop, sinister action hidden behind facades of well-meaning people, it's that novel is fabulous. And then of course I have to plug May Cobb's My Summer Darlings for folks who haven't read that book. May's just phenomenal. And I love that she's just making a name for herself and carving out this brand of East Texas women behaving very, very badly and drinking copious amounts of whiskey, and getting up to slightly murderous things. Maybe I just love that she does it so well.
She's a really wonderful author. If you're interested in the Jayatissa, I did a Zoom event with her. She's in Sri Lanka, so we had to adjust the time. Patrick, you were, alas, because you like her a lot. You were in Hawaii once again when
a little bit smitten with her. She's a lovely.
She's amazing.
Yeah.
The dark wedding subgenre could be kind of an extension of the, sort of the locked room idea. A question. I was just going to say, a question has come in. For Lauren, Sherry would like to know. She says, "Congratulations on your debut. What did you do when you found out your book was going to be published?"
Well, thanks, Sherry. I decided to leave teaching. That was kind of the big thing that I decided to do when I got the book deal. Is I knew I really, especially since I'm a German professor, those jobs are few and far between. And as much as I love teaching, I never was able to choose where I lived. And so writing, of course, you can write anywhere. And so getting the book deal, finding out the novel was going to be published. And I got a 2-book deal. So knowing that I had not just the first book to write, but also the second, that meant that I could live where I wanted, which was just a huge, after, a decade of, moving for a PhD and then teaching these different visiting professor jobs. That was a huge and amazing thing for me to be able to live where I wanted to live.
Wonderful.
There is one question that just came in, and you've talked about this a little bit, but this person on YouTube says, "I'd love to hear a bit about each of your writing processes." So how do you get the words out each day? Any rituals, any word counts? What's your process?
Go ahead, Lauren.
Okay. Well, I feel because of kind of certain more personal things right now in my life, I don't have the ritual that I used to have. I will say one thing that I've noticed that I do is I will write a lot. So I'll get 60,000 words of a story start. And then I go back and make an outline, which I don't know if it is the most productive or the best way to work, but that seems to be how I work. Is I start and I just need to get the ideas out. And then I go back and I find the structure, or I create the structure and then, put everything into that structure. So that's one thing I do. I used to write in the mornings and I would try to get, 1,000, 2,000 words, but I've found recently, and maybe it's because of the book tour and stuff, having to do a lot of this more social media self-promotion, that I tend to do that now in the morning. And then I'm writing in the afternoons. It used to be, I couldn't write after I ate. Like if I ate lunch, the creativity went away with the meal or something. So I would wait to eat, when I got my writing seriously done, but that seems to have all changed recently. So I don't know, Ashley, if maybe you have a better system or structure.
No, I'm just the weirdest creature because I'm so finicky. I do the exact same thing every day. I eat the same breakfast and lunch, and I just work. I wake up, I make my coffee, make my breakfast, sit down in the exact same spot, write until lunch at a certain time where I break, eat the same thing, come back and write until my husband drags me away. With like the need to actually be a human being in the world. So, and if anything like deviates from this very strict routine, it's like immediately banished. Like cats, if they're running around too much, they have to leave. Like my husband, if he comes in and asks me a question, he's like banished to, the other side of the house. And so, yeah, if there's any deviation, then it's like all my creativity leaves as well.
But I love that discipline. I think so many writers, I mean, you really do, you have to have a discipline, a routine. It's almost like athletes who have to wear a certain sock, right? That routine becomes the lucky sock. If you can just keep to the routine, then you can get the work done. But if that sock is in the wash or something happens to the routine, then it really does feel kind of precious and ephemeral in that way, right? That it can just disappear.
Music
I'm wearing my
music?
lucky sock, which is this necklace.
What's that?
I said music or no music?
Oh, no music whatsoever for me.
Silence. Okay.
Yeah.
Normally no music, but there are certain, so one of the scenes in the Resemblance, which takes place in a basement, I wrote listening to the same song on repeat. There was something about just the themes of that song and the kind of darkness of that song that helped me write that scene. And it was actually what I was going to call the novel first. Ashley, I don't know if you're like this, but whatever my novel is called in my Word doc is not normally what it ends up being called.
Never. I've never struggled with the title. Yeah, it's always changed.
Yeah, it always. So I had called this novel in my head and in the Word doc Grotesque Animal, which comes from an Of Montreal, which is an Athens band, song called The Past is a Grotesque Animal. There's actually a reference really early on to that song in the novel itself, and that's what it was called. But my editor felt like it sounded like a young adult mystery title, which did not fit the themes of this novel, so it changed. But I think that's every once in a while to get into a certain headspace, maybe, but most of the time I'm with Ashley. I tend to like to work in silence.
I love thinking to music, in the shower, on a walk, but then once I get to, and I will do the exact same thing where there's like 2 songs per book that I listen to on ad nauseum on repeat, and then silence when I write. So really, really fun person to live with over here. Yeah.
So the lesson from all this is that writers have to have understanding families, spouses, whatever it is. Ladies, it's really been a pleasure to listen to you both. Lauren, congratulations again on publishing The Resemblance, your 7th, or is it 8th? But
Yeah.
first published novel, so very exciting. And Ashley, it's wonderful to see you again, The Last Housewife. We still have signed copies, and I'm hoping that we'll see you for a book next year at some point.
Yeah, I can't wait. Thank you so much, Barbara and Patrick and Lauren. Congratulations.
Indeed.
Love your book.
Yeah,
Enjoy
thank
the
you
rest
all.
of your week. It's so exciting to have, like your first publication week. So enjoy it all.